To Michael Jacobs, a professor of political economy at the University of Sheffield. He joins us now from London. Michael, thank you so much indeed. Listen, this point about countries that have declared climate emergencies, and there are quite a number of them now, the EU being the latest organisation, shall we say, to do the same, and yet these countries are giving money to support fossil fuel industries. How does that tally, and why are they doing that?
Well, you have to understand that policymaking in governments doesn't occur rationally. So for a long time, all governments around the world have been subsidising fossil fuels. This is a huge weakness in climate policy that's been around now for 20 years, that at the same time that countries are trying to reduce emissions by renewable energy and so on, they are also supporting fossil fuels. So this isn't rational, but this is what policymaking is like. And it is a good thing that, having realised the extent of the climate emergency that scientists have been telling us about for a long time now, it's not new, that governments are acknowledging that we have an emergency situation, meaning we have to act now, because if we don't, we're going to run into the catastrophic effects of unchecked climate change. So the first thing governments do that realise this, that have pressure put on them by their civil societies, is they then set a goal. And many governments around the world, including the UK, including the EU, have set this goal of net zero emissions. So basically take greenhouse gas emissions out of the economy altogether by 2050. But of course, it's much easier to set the goal than to implement the policies. So they announce the goal first, and then you have to ramp up the pressure to get them actually to act on their goal. And fossil fuel subsidies is one of those areas that they've not yet done so. OK, Michael, congratulations. You've answered almost every question I've got listed down here on my piece of paper before I came into the studio. So let's break it down one by one. You'll have to think of some new ones.
Yes, exactly. OK, well, here you go. I've got a new one. Carbon capture, right? These big businesses, these fossil fuel industries say that that is the way forward. That's the way we can help to secure the future of the planet. But environmental campaigners say, actually, that's a bit of a myth. And we need to look beyond carbon capture. We actually need to reduce those emissions. What about those two equations?
So it partly depends on what you mean by carbon capture. So there is geological carbon capture, which is taking emissions from fossil fuel industries and power stations, capturing them and then burying them underground, usually actually where the oil originally came from, under the sea, or it can be under the land. That is a technology which is proven but really has not been rolled out. It's expensive. And we will have to do that because there is so much fossil production that in order to reduce emissions in the atmosphere by sufficient amounts to get us on a pathway to global warming of no more than 1.5 degrees, we're going to have to do that much more than we've done so far, as well as reducing emissions. And these things are not alternatives. The other kind of capture is in vegetation. So nature, trees, vegetation, soils, the oceans naturally capture carbon, and we need to increase that by planting more trees, getting more vegetation and so on. But again, that's not an excuse for reducing emissions. We need to do all of these things. We cannot simply rely on one of them. And we must be very careful that industries, particularly the heavy energy using industries, don't use planting trees as an excuse for not cutting their emissions. We need to do both of these things, and we can't have one substituting for the other or acting as an excuse for not doing the other.
OK, we were talking about the EU declaring a state of emergency in terms of the climate crisis, the European Parliament saying that our house is on fire. And you've rightly pointed out that aspirations are one thing, declaring a climate emergency is totally different to getting member states to actually comply with the desire to be carbon neutral by the year 2050. In simplistic terms, is it really an issue of governments, do you believe, being too scared to force people to sacrifice so much of what they have? I don't know how many cars you've got in your driveway outside the home from where you're speaking to us, but doing away with our cars or becoming more efficient, traveling less by airplane, all of those things, buying a new refrigerator. It's a question of individuals having to sacrifice their current lifestyle, but being forced to do so by governments. And politics is never going to be successful if it makes people actually live a less affluent and comfortable lifestyle, correct?
Yes, and governments here are scared of that. When I say here, governments all around the world are scared of effectively asking people to take a cut in their living standards or to change their behaviour, for example, how often they fly or how much meat they eat, which they're worried that the public are not willing to do, or will blame them for it and then will vote them out of office. On the other hand, there is another agenda that I think, and another narrative that I think is becoming more and more attractive to politicians and more and truer. If I'm looking at the same pictures as you're showing on the screen, you've got cities that are deeply polluted. New Delhi this year, just a few weeks ago, had pollution levels which were completely toxic for people to live in. Beijing and the other Chinese cities have been experiencing this for a long time. I've not recently been to Istanbul or other Turkish cities, but I suspect the same is true. And it's true in London, where I'm speaking from. So there's a very positive agenda, which goes along with the climate agenda, which says we actually want to create air that people can breathe and cities that people can live in. And similarly, a lot of governments are now acknowledging that if you invest in renewable energy or in more sustainable forms of transport or energy efficiency, you create a lot of jobs. So in countries where there is still a major problem of unemployment, there are real jobs to be created in the green industries that will also reduce emissions. So in a way, governments are now trying to make the positive argument for climate action and trying to ensure that people don't feel too scared by some of the things that may happen to their living standards. And that's a very difficult balance for politicians, and they're all struggling with it. But at least they are now struggling with it, and they're trying to find a story to tell their publics on what they will have to do.
Michael, thank you so much. Really very interesting to hear analysis, and have a really lovely weekend. Michael Jacobs from the University of Sheffield speaking to us from London.